Thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation to talk. So we don't have a huge crowd, so if anyone has questions, do feel free to interrupt, but hopefully I'm not going to take the whole time, so we'll have time for questions at the end as well. This is a project I always like to talk about, is measuring and modeling neighborhoods, because I think we all have a very personal connection to our neighborhoods, and that's actually kind of the point of this research is that personal connection, that subjectivity. So, one of the things we, think is that neighborhoods matter, and there's a lot of research on this. Neighborhoods both as, mediators and causes of a lot of, complex social effects and interactions. They have implications for how, public goods are distributed, how people sort of perceive themselves, where they spend their time, who they interact with. So there's just, a lot of the things we like to study in the social sciences flow in some way or connected in some way to people's neighborhoods. And I think we all recognize that, but the challenge is that it's very hard to measure neighborhoods because they're really fundamentally subjective. As far as the things we care about neighborhoods for, like social networks and things of that nature, the neighborhood we're talking about when we talk about those types of effects is the one that people sort of have in their heads, not the one that is on the city map or defined by the Census Bureau or what have you. And so there's this sort of challenge of how do we work with people's individualized sort of conceptions of their neighborhood and do good science with that, do quantitative work with that. So that's kind of what motivated this project. And we're not, we don't answer the whole question, but we are going to give a way to measure neighborhoods, a way to model neighborhoods, and I think that's going to then open some doors for people to do other studies where neighborhoods are just a component. So basically, we put a couple things together to do that. And the first thing we do is we actually have a custom survey tool that we built that I'll talk about that helps researchers collect respondents in neighborhoods as they themselves perceive them. And then we built a model to help analyze these neighborhoods and the factors that shape sort of what goes into them. And that lets us, together with data that we actually collected from a survey of voters in US cities, we can actually estimate the impact that factors like race, partisanship, education, and so on have on people's subjective perceptions of their own neighborhoods. So we'll sort of walk through those pieces in one at a time. And the first is this survey. So we built a sort of web widget that you can embed in, for instance, a Qualtrics survey. And users type in their address, and then the map sort of zooms to that address and puts a pin there. And then they use a sort of a brush tool to color in parts of the map that they think are part of their neighborhood. You can customize the instructions there, and they can erase, they can move around, they can zoom in, they can zoom out. When they're done, then they submit that. And what they're coloring in is actually sort of up to you. In our case, we used US Census Bureau blocks. So this is the smallest geographic unit provided by the Census Bureau. And it's what it sounds like. It's city blocks, highway lanes, things of that nature. So very granular, and people will basically color in the blocks that correspond to their neighborhood. And then that list of blocks is what's returned to the survey application. We ran a survey where we use this, and we pair that with a whole bunch of demographic and political questions about each respondent. And so we're going to look how these demographic features sort of interact with the demographics on the ground near the person's residence and how those come together to shape people's neighborhoods. So we sent an invitation to take this survey to about 1.5 million voters in 3 US cities, so Phoenix, New York, and Miami. So we wanted to sort of look at different types of urban environment, different demographic sort of mixes in different cities. New York is obviously the go-to with neighborhoods that people feel are very well defined, just tons of diversity, a lot of density, but not every city is like New York, so we wanted to put in some sort of different cities as well. So I say cities, we send these to people in the metropolitan areas, so it's not just people in the city center, in the urban core, but also in the surrounding suburbs. So we got about 2,500 complete responses, all of our questions and the maps. And this was actually part of a larger survey experiment, which I'm not going to talk about. So most of the analyses I'll show you today were done on the sort of the control group from this survey, which is about 500. So just to give you an idea of the types of data we collect, so got all the demographics, but we also get people's neighborhoods. So here's a respondent who lives in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, outside Miami, and You can see this. So here in the middle, that black shaded block, that's the block where this person lives. And then they have shaded in this outlined area. And then I'm showing you on the map, population density is indicated by the shading. So you can see there's like a river canal system over here that no one lives at. And then we've also colored blocked with schools on them in yellow and blocks with parks on them in blue. And we already noticed some patterns about how people's neighborhoods extend to cover schools in the area. Maybe they stop at park boundaries. So this starts to, raise questions like, can we model that? Can we measure the effect that, for instance, local features like parks and schools have on people's neighborhoods? That can be one of the goals. No, I should have. Okay, so we can look at other things as well. So here on the right, we've colored the map into blocks. These sort of larger areas are delineated by major roads, railroads, and waterways. And so we also notice then that this respondent's neighborhood is sort of bounded on the west by a major road. And we might ask ourselves, to what extent do things like major roads also shape people's neighborhoods? So that was Fort Lauderdale. Here's an example of someone who lives in the Bronx in New York City. And once again, there's their residence there. And on the right, we also have these road rail regions. And you can see again, the northern boundary there is bounded exactly by these road rail regions. And, there's a lot of parks and a lot of schools, so maybe the pattern is less clear. And if you know New York, this is like, considered sort of a well-defined, sub-neighborhood in the city. Give you one more example from New York. Here's someone who lives in Brooklyn, and you can see some of the human touch in drawing here. So there's some water blocks or piers that didn't get included in their drawing. But once again, this is a very well sort of defined area of Brooklyn, including sort of the downtown area of Brooklyn, and it stops again at some of these road rail regions on these major roadways, these waterways, and so on. So these are the types of data we get, and I should mention that the mapping tool enforces that the neighborhoods that people draw are geographically connected, contiguous. So you've seen that in all three examples. Other than that, we don't have any constraints. So the neighborhoods can be very big, they can be very small, they can have holes in them like this one does. And the question then is what can we actually do with all this data that we've collected? How can we model it?
There's a question in the chat.
Great.
Whether we can use adaptive clustering technique here.
Yeah, so it kind of depends what you want to do with things. In general, I'm not a huge fan of clustering unless there's really clusters. Clustering can create a lot of artifacts in the data. It's a little unclear how you can cluster geographic data like this in a principled way, especially if the clusters you get, you want that at the cluster centers, you want them to reflect the same constraints that we've imposed. So I mentioned that we want neighborhoods to be geographically connected, geographically contiguous. That's a pretty tough requirement to enforce with a clustering algorithm, for instance. That being said, the model that I will talk about next, there's ways to back out of that consensus neighborhoods or clusters or things of that nature. In the paper, we talk about that in the context of city council districting in New York City. I don't think I have slides on it, but that's not in a very, it's a kind of a similar spirit to what we're trying to do here, is come up with some regularity, come up with some patterns from this messy individual data. So thanks for the question. All right, so when I say model, we're trying to come up with a statistical model that will let us evaluate the impact of different factors on these neighborhoods. So that requires sort of a generative story that we tell for how these neighborhoods end up in our system. And so the story that we came up with, the sort of generative model that we're going to fit, looks like this. So you have the block in which, so this is going back to this respondent in Fort Lauderdale. This is a satellite image of their neighborhood, and that white square right there is their house, and that's the block that they live in. What the model says is, okay, so this block is always going to be in the neighborhood. Your own residence is in the neighborhood definitionally. But then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the surrounding blocks one at a time in order of closest to the residence to farthest from the residence. And for each of these blocks, we'll look at it, and there's going to be some probability that this block is included in the neighborhood. And that's going to be parameterized by demographic features, how those interact with the respondents' demographics, things that we'll talk about that later. But there's some sort of statistical model for the probability that this block gets included. and then, randomly include it with that probability, and let's say in this case it was included, you move then on to the next block, and there's some probability this block is included. And you keep going in this manner. Eventually you're going to get a block where the model says there's maybe samples where does not end up in the neighborhood. So like here, this block we just went through, this yellow block here, ended up not being included in the neighborhood. So I've colored it black. And what that means is blocks further away from this block, blocks that touch this block that wasn't included, those are no longer going to be considered. So this is how we enforce the contiguity constraint, is that we only consider blocks in this sort of step-by-step process that are already touching blocks that have been included. So we keep sort of going through this model, and we end up with, ultimately, we keep looking at blocks, is we end up with a set of blocks that are all in the neighborhood, bounded by a set of blocks that have decided to be excluded from the neighborhood. And at this point, there's nowhere else to go, because if we were to look at any other block, it would be impossible to connect it to the neighborhood. So the big idea here is we're going to start at the center, we're going to work our way outward. The model tells us the probability of including each of the blocks. Once a block is excluded, that sort of limits our ability to keep expanding the neighborhood in that direction. And eventually you end up with a neighborhood totally surrounded by excluded blocks. And that's where this process ends. So that's kind of the probabilistic generative story here. And that's kind of that story that model is going to let us then estimate the impact of these different factors.
Do natural barriers like the river define non-contiguency of neighborhoods?
So no, we don't. We let, like, if a water block is what connects two areas and people include that, we do allow that. Although you could certainly modify. The model is very happy to let you put that restriction or take that restriction out. When we ran this survey, we did not. We let water blocks be included and connect areas. But if you felt that wasn't something appropriate, then you could definitely exclude that. So when you design the survey, you provide the survey tool with a mathematical graph that actually says which blocks are touching each other, and it's up to you to define what touching means. And so if you want to connect areas that are actually far apart, or disconnect areas that are technically touching but only linked by a water or natural barrier, then you're free to do that. And the model is totally agnostic to how you set that up. That's a good question. Thank you. All right, so how does this model actually look? I'm not going to go into all the details. There's more math in the paper, but the idea is that the probability of entering the neighborhood is going to decay with distance from the residence. So the farther a block is from where you live, the less likely it is to be included in the neighborhood. And so there's two sort of parameters that govern this. One is sort of the length scale. Some people might have neighborhoods that might just generally be willing to include blocks that are much farther from their house than other people. So there's like what's the length scale on which this decay happens? And there's also the shape of the decay. Is it sort of like, is it like this yellow curve where you're very, very likely to include things up to a certain distance and then very, very unlikely to include them past a certain distance? Or is the decay more gradual? So these are sort of two parameters that we sort of learn from the data. But the big contribution is to say, we're not just going to use distance as the crow flies. That's going to be a component, distance as the crow flies, but we're also going to let that distance be affected by covariates, predictors. So we really think about it as there's like an effective spatial distance, which is what we call it, like an effective distance that governs the probability that you're included. And so maybe a block is, a quarter mile away, but it's demographically completely different, and it's a different side of a railroad track than where you are. So as the crow flies, it's a quarter mile, but effectively, psychologically, it might feel like it's a half mile away, and therefore have a lower probability of being included. And so we basically have this like linear predictor term that modifies the spatial distance to create this notion of effective distance, and that's sort of what the model ends up using. So again, we're building out the model block by block, and the probability that you're included in the block depends on your spatial distance, but sort of modified by these predictors that we can include. That's as far as I'll go in the details. The paper has a lot more, but so great. For people who like math, I'll just briefly talk about something here, and this is not really necessary to follow the rest of it, but what's nice about this is when you write this model down, it turns out you can do some algebra and you can end up rewriting it as a generalized linear model. And that's super nice because there's a ton of statistical tools out there for fitting and doing computation with these models. And so although we end up having quite a lot of data every single block that's included or excluded in people's maps becomes a data point in these models that we're fitting. Despite that amount of data, we don't have to do a lot of fancy things to fit these models. You can use off-the-shelf statistical packages to estimate this neighborhood model that I've outlined. So that's really nice because people don't have to use our software. They can innovate and extend these models in their own ways, and then just use off-the-shelf statistical software to fit them. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are the predictors, the covariates that go into this model. What are the other factors beyond geographic distance that we allow to influence people's neighborhoods? So the first is the area and population of a block. So maybe small blocks are less likely to be included. There's no one that lives in a block, maybe it's less likely to be included. We have an indicator for a block having a church, a park, or a school, so that goes into the model. And then we have indicators for the block being in the same census block group, census tract. So these are levels of the census geographic hierarchy. So blocks are the smallest, blocks belong to block groups belong to tracts. And so we have some indicators for whether or not you're in that same part of the hierarchy, or whether you're in a different part of the hierarchy. And then, as I mentioned, we have these sort of road regions. These are areas of the map that are bounded by major roads. And so if you're in a different road region from where you live, there's a variable for measuring that. We put in all the individual demographics. So when I put in individual demographics into this model, what that means is there might be certain demographics that tend to, just across the board, increase or decrease this effective distance. So there might be some people who just tend to draw bigger neighborhoods, some people that tend to draw smaller neighborhoods. Maybe if you're older, less mobile, your neighborhood tends to shrink. Maybe if you're younger, maybe if you love to run, it gets bigger, right? So we allow for individual demographics to shape the overall neighborhood size, although we don't think those effects are going to be that big. What's really interesting is the interaction between individual demographics and the block's demographics. So we look at, for every block, what fraction of that block is in the same demographic groups as the respondent themselves. So if the respondent's white, we're looking at the white percentage, but if the respondent's black, we're looking at the black percentage. And so we're interacting the respondent's demographics and the block demographics. We look at the fraction of each block at the same racial group, political party, educational background, and home ownership or renter status. So this is sort of the way that we think that people might draw neighborhoods in a more inclusive or exclusive way based on sort of the demographics or political geography of the area around them. So all this goes in the model in addition to spatial distance, and then we fit it, and then we get estimates of how much each of these factors, what the effect of these factors are on people's neighborhoods. So I'll pause there just for a couple seconds in case people have questions about that.
Oh, could I ask a question?
Of course.
I can just jump in. Sure. I'm wondering to what extent, empirically anyway, is the variability in how expansive people are about perceiving their neighborhood? How is that sort of partitioned into, where you're located versus who you are? If that makes sense. Is that something you
people people maybe in like dense parts of the city might just have smaller neighborhoods, and people in like exurbs might have much more expansive neighborhoods?
No, I guess I mean, there's this sort of, I'm having a hard time expressing this. I guess what I mean is to what extent do differences in subjective neighborhood size, are they attributable to differences within individuals making these judgments as opposed to differences in where they happen to live, the sort of road boundaries, the kind of demographics of their neighborhood? Are both of these sort of important, or one dominates the other, or they interact, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a slide on this. So I mean, what's nice about the model is we are able to separate those things, right? So controlling for all those factors, we do measure basically the variability across individuals of the size of the neighborhoods. And this actually might be my next slide. Okay, this is my next slide. Okay, right. So basically, even after doing this, there's ridiculously large variability. So people are drawing neighborhoods, as small as 100 people, as big as 100,000 people. From from an acre to 100 square miles. So part of this was the sort of open-ended way in which we phrase the prompt, which is just draw what you consider to be your neighborhood. But controlling for all this stuff explained a very small fraction of people's neighborhood sizes. There's just a lot of heterogeneity and how people interpret the word neighborhood, at least. I think if we'd asked something like, shade in the areas that you regularly go in your day-to-day life, right, we would have had a more, maybe less variability.
Right. But that pool of variation is really super interesting though, right? Because you can go and figure out, what kinds of individual characteristics are associated with this sort of more expansive or restrictive conception of what neighborhood means to me. Yeah, anyway, I'll let you get back to your presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we were hoping to see more correlates of like just the size of the neighborhood. Didn't find a ton. There's a couple maybe, but yeah, it just really seems that people are very unique and just produce very different looking neighborhoods. Okay, so that's one finding that's sort of on top of all this is just like, not that we have R squared exactly, but like basically R squared is very low. There's just a lot of individual variability. That being said, we have enough observations because every single time someone includes or excludes a block, that's really a decision they made. That's an observation. So we have enough observations to be able to then pull out still some patterns on top of all this.
There's another question in the
great.
chat. If we block in same group, is there any effect of ignoring hidden factors?
Could someone maybe elaborate on what they meant by that? I mean, there's certainly factors that we didn't put into the model, right? So, and you'd be welcome to put in more, right? Like, so we have, this is a recipe for people to put in other factors they wanted. I think part of the reason we want to put in these spatial controls like block groups, like tracks, is that the Census Bureau does, it doesn't draw, I don't know how it works in Canada, but like in the US, the Census Bureau designs these block groups and tracks to the extent possible around existing sort of natural features, existing neighborhood, like well-recognized neighborhood boundaries and so on. And so this is kind of a way of, measuring to what extent sort of the traditional administrative divisions shape people's perceptions. To the extent that those, are based on a bunch of factors that we didn't measure, then that would be a way.
I mean, there are no kinds of interactions, right?
Sorry, what was that?
I mean, in that cases, there are no kinds of interaction effects.
There are what kind of interaction effects?
Because in different kinds of groups, if we block in, and in that cases, so interaction effects will come. But if we block in the same group, so interactions are ignored. So in that cases, what will be the effect?
I'm not sure I'm following. Maybe we're using, okay, let me just go back, make sure we're on the same page here. So when I say block here, that's like census block, not like statistical, like experimental design blocking. Do we agree on that? So I'm not like, yeah, so this is just like, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. I'm sorry.
So I feel that it is like a design blocks, or it's different kinds of, but actually it's not a design block, right?
Right, sorry. So this is like, these are these census blocks. These are like the units in which we build a neighborhood. So we measure whether the unit in which we're looking at belongs to the block group. And that's like, again, a census geography, a census tract, and things of that nature. So all these same predictors go into every single individual's model. All these interaction terms go into every individual's model. Sorry if that was unclear. All right, so what do we find? So I'm going to show you here is coefficient estimates. These are a little hard to interpret, so I'll sort of walk you through the important ones. But basically, down the y-axis is the different coefficients we'll look at, and then the estimates that are going to be plotted in the middle here. So the first thing we find is that block area and block population do matter. So larger populations and larger areas are predictive of being included in the neighborhood. And then conversely, like unpopulated areas are less likely to be included. For whatever reason, the Miami estimate of population is pretty variable, much closer to 0. Could be the way the blocks are set up around Miami, a lot of canals, a lot of other, in which blocks are sort of adjacent to each other. Miami is very weird because of all the water that we think that may affect things. We looked at some other things as well. This is just a couple of the coefficients. The interesting ones are these interactions between demographics of the respondent and the neighborhoods themselves. So on race, we find that for white respondents, blocks that had a higher fraction of white voters were more likely to be included, and blocks that had a lower fraction of white voters were less likely to be included. So this is demonstrating a preference for homogeneity, racial homogeneity by white respondents that we actually don't see from minority respondents. So this would be consistent with a lot of literature. What's interesting about that, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So we see a very similar, even more consistent story on the partisan front. So Democrats want to include Democrats and Republicans want to include Republicans in their neighborhood. And then it turns out a lot more mixed results for education. So not a lot of consistency across cities, although the one consistent pattern would be that, college educated respondents seem to display sort of stronger preferences than non-college educated respondents for college educated areas. But again, a lot of heterogeneity. It seems like in New York and Phoenix, there's some affinity among college educated voters, but that's not present in Miami. So a little unclear sort of what's going on with this story. We unfortunately do measure education at a coarser geographic level due to limitations in the census data, so that could play into this as well. But what's interesting about this is, to me, not only do we find this preference for same party, for co-partisan and co-racial blocks, but this is after controlling and for where people live, right? So we already know that there's residential segregation, people move to neighborhoods that already look a lot like them, with people like them, and that's driven a huge amount of segregation, certainly in the United States over the last 50 years. What's interesting is that even once you do that, and then you ask people in the area they've already moved to, already chosen to draw their neighborhoods, we still see at the subjective level these preferences for people of the same racial group and the same political party. So if anything, that's even these effects aren't massive, but they're still pretty surprising to us given the fact that people have already sort of self-segregated and even just choosing where to live. Okay, so you can do these estimates, for the whole model. That's nice. You get the story I told you about, but another nice thing you get, because we're fitting this rich spatial probabilistic model, is we can actually zoom into individual respondents and apply the model to individual respondents. So here again is this respondent who lives in Fort Lauderdale, and neighborhoods outlined there in black. On the left, we're looking at the block the block level map for percent white. And then on the right is percent college educated. And so you can see already that this person has sort of entered their neighborhood on the southern portion there, sort of along a racial boundary that also sort of correlates with an education boundary. And there's sort of an education boundary here in the northeast of their neighborhood, a little bit of a racial boundary there, and these are also where their neighborhood are ending. So we might wonder, is this consistent with the story on the previous slide? The model was sort of looking at preferences for this happens to be a white respondent that we're talking about. So this maybe seems consistent. What we can actually do is use the model and have it predict, sort of run that process I outlined, and actually have it sort of build 1,000 different versions of what it predicts this person's neighborhood to be, based only on their demographics and the location of their residence. And then we can sort of compare that to the actual neighborhood they drew us. But what's interesting is you can sort of flip back and forth here. You can see this area in black that they actually drew, and how similar it is to the sort of set of predicted neighborhoods at the model. And you can see that there's at the very beginning I sort of showed you that there were some borders here that corresponded to major roads, and you can kind of see how the probability of a block being in this person's neighborhood drops off here at these borders, and also sort of along some of these education or racial divides. Better yet, so what we can also do is we can actually fit the model twice. So we do is, so to sort of help dive into this a little more, we fit the model twice, once with all the demographic, racial, partisan information, and once without that. We have a baseline model that only looks at geographic features, so spatial distance, parks, schools, but no race, no party, no education. And we can actually compare the predictions of these two models, the one that has all the demographic information, the one that doesn't. And that's a way of sort of teasing out the impact of some of these factors at a very, very fine geographic level. So that's what this is showing here. This center area, so blue areas are where the full model is more likely to include, and the brown areas where it's less likely to include. So you can see sort of basically where there's strong colors here, that's where these demographics are coming into play and how the neighborhood is drawn. So again, here on the right, you can see the person's neighborhood, and south of their neighborhood in this purple area, that's where there's a lot of minority voters, and this is a white respondent. And that's exactly what we see here with this difference map. Is south of their neighborhood, we have these areas that are much less likely to be included once demographics are accounted for than in a model where there's no demographics whatsoever. So we really like this model, not just as a way to get sort of these overall coefficient estimates, but also be able to zoom in to an individual respondent and see what are the impact of, for instance, demographics on whether a particular census block was included in this person's neighborhood, and to be able to visualize that on a map. Okay, so that's actually a good place for me to stop. I'm so happy to talk about any part of this. I have some backup slides and so on, but we're sort of excited to see where this goes. It's been published, it's appeared in print, but we have some software that helps people sort of fit, or at least work with the data for these models, and I think there's a lot of interesting extensions people could do to apply this to different contexts or to extend the model in different ways. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for the talk. This was super duper interesting. You kind of touched on this, but one of the things that I was thinking was about this kind of political, ideological sorting that happens or has been happening over, the past decades, at least in the United States. Is this a sort of plausible? I mean, you mentioned that you're still picking up these sort of sorting effects, even when accounting for the fact that people have already made decisions about where to live. Is that the sort of Is this a kind of plausible explanatory mechanism, at least at a sort of fine geographical level, for how and why this kind of sortation is going on? Is this a useful kind of way to think about that question?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so I never want to oversell this because this is very limited. And again, like this is not a representative survey. Like we emailed a bunch of people, but like we got it. So I want to be very cautious. However, so one thing I didn't mention is there was a survey experiment that we ran as part of this. Let me see if I can actually pull that up. Yeah. So in addition to just having people draw their neighborhood, we also so a fifth of the people got the control map with just a blank map that drew their neighborhood. Other people got maps that were colored according to political parties or according to race. So the party condition, we colored orange for Democrats and purple for Republicans. And this is not raw percentages, but relatively where they're more or less. And we then told people what the key, what these colors meant. We also ran a version where we didn't tell people what these colors meant, just to see if the colors themselves affected the drawing. Okay. We did the same thing for party. Sorry, same thing for race. So it was very interesting. I don't know if I have the picture. Whoops, do I have the picture? Yeah, so it was very basically this is looking at whether or not the experimental condition, this is interactions of the experimental condition with all the variables I showed you. And basically it's a bunch of null results, some stuff in certain directions, but basically we did not really find any consistent differences between, this picture across experimental conditions. So what did that tell us? Well, we basically, our takeaway from that was that people actually have a pretty good idea of what the sort of local geography looks like. So that coloring the map in some random way doesn't really change people to draw their neighborhood, nor does providing them with information. If we see people have these preferences. So if they had these preferences and were unaware about their local neighborhood, then maybe providing them with this information would change things, but they didn't really. So I think we think that, what we haven't done is we have not done a recontact survey, which would be interesting to do, but we think people are pretty aware of their local sort of very fine geographic patterns around them. And I think that our experimental condition lends support to that. What that means for your question is that maybe yes, it is worth that does support this idea that people know at a pretty fine level what's going on, what type of people live where, and that informs both where they choose to live and then how they perceive the neighborhood after that.
Right. Yeah. Like for instance, an idea that occurs to me is, to taking an ethnographic perspective and looking at individuals, to what extent does the sort of expansiveness of their neighborhood maybe predict whether they want to move to a place where they, sort of fit in better, where they're in perhaps a sort of bigger, more homogenized, politically, racially, educationally kind of neighborhood or not. I mean, that's obviously not maybe something you can answer now, but it gets me thinking about ideas like that.
We could at least look at, because we basically estimate individual level coefficients for this expansiveness, each respondent gets an estimate there. So we could totally overlay that, correlate that with, see to what extent that correlates with some of the stuff you mentioned.
Can we use here the genetic mappings?
What was that, sorry?
To evaluate this? Genetic mapping.
Genetic?
Mapping.
Sorry, can you just say the whole question again? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm following.
Actually, sir, for the peoples who are outside, but actually
Mhm.
the before question, in that question, the answer is like that of genetic mapping. If we use the genetic mapping, can there be any problems?
Okay, I'm not sure I have much to add to that, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very interesting directions I think you could go with this. We've sort of really just scratched the surface, and this is really sort of a pilot study in some ways. Like we didn't, you could ask even more questions. You could really target things. We did another version of this with city council districts, asked a pretty similar battery of questions and found pretty similar results, but with a different sort of survey population. But there's a lot of different, a lot of different things you could do, I think.
I'm really struck by that about the just range of applications in terms of what you're asking people to identify geographically. And two examples that popped into my head right away were a study that I did around food deserts and the recognition that someone's mobility has everything to do with how far it's okay for a grocery store to be from them. And it was a sort of fundamental limitation of most of the studies that have ever been done on food deserts. And then the other thing that struck me was I was recently talking to a researcher that has been looking at forced displacement of communities and the implications for the length of time that they have to spend in transit, the sort of challenges with how much geography impacts how they have to allocate their time. And it struck me, oh wow, yeah, this could totally work for that too. So I'm kind of bouncing ideas up my head of just the huge range of applications of this.
Yeah, so like, this now been a couple of years since we put this and got it to print. And I've cooled a little bit on some of the details in the model. I think we just made some choices. They weren't necessarily like the best choices, but I think like the overall thing we did, which was just sort of like survey people using geographies that we have a lot of separate information about from census and whatever, and then like building like a sort of very tailored spatial model for them, like and putting those together, like I think there's a ton of interesting things you could do there. Like you maybe set up the model differently for some of these questions, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff you could do. I work a lot in like elections, and so we think about like where are the polling places and how does that affect turnout and all this stuff. And obviously people have looked at some of these things, but rather than trying to shoehorn some of these geographic factors into like a linear regression model, we just want to from scratch basically do regression with the geography, as a predictor or as a response. And I think that's a very helpful perspective to take, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff to do. So yeah, I mean, I'm not an evangelist for this particular method, but I do hope that people sort of take this and try to do better versions of this, because there's just, like you say, there's so many great questions out there.
Hi, can I just add, and sorry, I couldn't make the beginning of your talk, so I will read with great interest that also your work, your paper. Yeah, my thinking about applications around this in Canada, oh my goodness, is definitely around electoral districting. And in Canada, we don't have the same kind of focus or conceptualization or focus on race as an issue. And we kind of think, race isn't really an issue in Canada. Of course it is. And we are, I think, still in Canadian research on things like maybe nascent political ambition or how districts get drawn where it's, race isn't as on the radar of that research as much as it needs to be. And so what this is making me think about is, so I was on an electoral boundary commission, and we don't use any race data well, I shouldn't say we don't use any race data. We have some very rudimentary data to try to ensure that we have communities of interest, that they're not split up. But then we have members of the public that come in the hearings, and most of them are really motivated by politics. Like they want to keep, they're brought in by their MP to participate in the process. And I think we could do some amazing work at asking the participants, the public participants in redistricting processes, what they think about what their what their neighborhood looks like, what their district should look like, and try to understand what is the role of partisanship, what is the role of race in those processes. But I think for research in Canada, this is really a blank slate. And so what you're showing us is super promising in terms of applications in Canada.
Thanks. Yeah, so I do a lot of work in redistricting, and if we think a lot about like one of the exciting frontiers is how can we take participatory map making data. So these days, like when Michigan redrew its districts, there was an online portal people could go to, and they could draw their own maps. They could say like, here's my community. So you have all this data. There's a huge selection bias in who answers this, and you want to sort of take that, somehow summarize it, somehow provide it to map makers in a useful way, and also debias it, so it isn't just the people who have time and have computers who get a say where the boundaries are drawn. But there's a lot of rich data. So anyway, we haven't really figured this out, but we're thinking a lot about, how can you sort of do that, because, and it's even more important in countries unlike the US where people actually care about drawing good sets of districts versus gerrymandered districts, because then they actually look at this community data versus just, trying to maximize the advantage. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to do there, and we've been thinking about specifically on the boundary, the constituency or district drawing side of things.
And can I ask, are you thinking about doing applications of your work outside of the US? Like, is that something?
We really should,
you have so much data,
especially for this type of map drawing, because it's so screwed up in the US, and we don't even have a democracy in the US for much longer. So yeah, we're not, that's where I know the data is certainly the best, but also the data has also been taken down in the last 2 weeks. So, I think we'd be excited to start to work on some stuff outside the US, but.
And I mentioned, but skipped through very quickly without really elaborating, the idea of nascent political ambition is really about who thinks about running in riding, and how do the perceptions of the demographic characteristics of their neighborhood, or maybe larger geographic units, they're more like the political units, but how does that shape whether they think that they have a viable chance as a candidate? And in terms of underrepresented groups, members of underrepresented groups, which is my research focus, right? I think it's really, again, really promising here to think about how racialized minorities think about their neighborhood and how whites think about their neighborhood, and then how that shapes, in turn, nascent political ambition.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. I think a lot about sort of like these predictors of who runs, but the geographic element of that is actually very important, as you point out. I haven't really thought about that. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll be just following up
Sir,
on that.
one more question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sir. Okay. So what is the basic difference, sir, between demographic matters and biodemographic matters? Because I have seen different kinds of literature saying biodemographic matters instead of demographic matters. So is there any kinds of basic difference?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with biodemographic, although certainly all this stuff matters, like how you are categorizing different people. Because we use US Census data, we're constrained to use racial groups, ethnic groups as defined by the Office of Management Budget. Those are actually changing for the next 2030 census. They're going to add Middle Eastern, North African as a category. They're going to change how Hispanic is interpreted. So all we're totally at least with the data we have, we're totally constrained by those categories, and that definitely does affect when in the experimental conditions where we show people the maps colored by race, those are those census categories. We didn't, for instance, pull in linguistic data and look at that. There's a whole bunch of other ways that might be important for people and how they think about their neighborhood that aren't legible to us, or we didn't have data for. That might have changed some of these patterns. So that's, I think, one of the bigger caveats with all this is how do we think about the right way to measure stuff. So I don't know biodemographics specifically, but I agree certainly that how you measure and categorize the demographics has a huge impact on the interpretation and the findings maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I was just gonna follow up on something Karen was saying about the sort of nascent political ambitions, but kind of more broadly, having these models for people's perceived neighborhoods rather than, the neighborhoods is defined by, census tracts or dissemination areas or whatever, maybe gives an opportunity to take a closer, better look at, person neighborhood fit, like how well is someone feel represented by their neighborhood as they perceive it, as opposed to just sort of a kind of crude comparison of, a person's individual differences and, the dissemination area they happen to live in or the block they happen to live in. Yeah, anyway, I just thought it's all really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, you can spend all day, I think, thinking about all the cool. So we have not, unfortunately, done a ton of follow-up with this directly, but yeah.
Well, if there's time, maybe that's one question I can ask. I sort of, reading between the lines, I get a little bit the sense, or you maybe literally said you're sort of cooled a bit on this methodology. Could you say something about why, or what's the sort of alternative that you're thinking
well,
about?
part of it is like it is a little bit involved. So when I come with new methods as like a stats person, I really try to like make software and like make it easy for people to use. And this is just hard to do that for because you have to have the survey tool and it spits out the data in a certain way, and then you have to sort of format it in a very certain way before you can put it in the model. Fitting the model itself is just like a certain, like it's like a version of logistic regression, but getting the data in the right, collecting it and getting the right format, and that's just a very involved thing. And so it's not plug and play the way that I kind of like the methodology I developed to be. And then, you just, the more you work with this data, the more you just worry about what about all the variables it didn't include? And so what do these coefficients even mean? So, I do like that we can, predict, like I think thinking about stuff that's built on predicting individual people's neighborhoods and summaries that come out from that are probably better than, like these coefficients are very hard to think about. But then you can take the model, whatever the coefficients are, you can predict individual people's neighborhoods, you can do these kind of contrast across models. Like we think is sort of a helpful direction. But then it's just like, but then the minute you want to change something, like let's say so we have this constraint about the neighborhoods have to be connected, contiguous. If you take that out, now the whole model breaks down. Everything like come up with a whole new type of model. So like people talk to me about looking at redlining. So there's like in the US, there were these like maps that were like pretty centralized that like the banks use to like where you're not going to lend to people. And so you want to look at those maps and say like, okay, what factors predicted what became redlined and what didn't become redlined. And obviously race is there, but there's other things as well. But those redlining areas weren't necessarily one contiguous unit. So then a whole different model is needed for those. So, or if we're studying like political districts, now you have multiple. So it's just every sort of setting has its own type of model and a lot of methodological challenges there. So that's why I just sort of become, I'd love for a method we could just hand off to someone. They just press go with their data set and they don't have to, do this crazy, work in it. We have yet to find the holy grail for making this easy for people. I think that's mostly why I've been a little.
Right. Yeah. So it's not, you're not sort of skeptical about your own method in so much as you're maybe worried about how hard it is to scale the damn thing up and get people to really use it.
Like you always know there's places to improve. I'm not saying this is, I'm definitely saying this is the best, but we do like it. And we were very like under review. We had to actually like run a whole new survey and fit the model to that. And it was super consistent, all these copartisan, co-racial preference findings. So that's definitely there, I think, but making, for things that aren't that, and for extending it and scaling it up, that's kind of a.
Right. Yeah. But if someone was excited to kind of pick this tool up and, felt comfortable doing all this complicated data restructuring you're talking about, you wouldn't say, well, maybe don't.
No, I would not. And
okay, great.
It's all online, all like both the model and the survey tool. So, we hope people do, but yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
Fantastic.